It is my pleasure to introduce the talk of Nir Fresco and Eva Jablonka. Eva Jablonka is considered as one of the world's foremost experts in epigenetic inheritance and evolution, and has authored numerous papers and books on the subject. She is a professor at the Cohn Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Ideas at the Tel Aviv University. Nir Fresco is a researcher fellow at the Edelstein Center for the History and Philosophy of Science, and he works on the aim of his research is to better understand how information processing contributes to our cognitive life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elvira. Before I get started, I actually want to take this opportunity to formally thank all our speakers and all our chairs. I know that at least one speaker has left already today. So it's a pleasure to have all of you here, and I think we have a very good, fruitful exchange. And one more thing I should say before I get started, because I'll forget by the time I get to the end. Myself and Eva are noted here, but this is also part of a collaborative work with Zohar Bronfman from Tel Aviv University and Simona Ginsburg from the Open University. So we made sure to keep it gender balanced. Okay. So, an outline. The talk will basically be divided in two main parts. The first part will basically give us a sense of what we mean when we say functional information. That's a different project, and telling more about it would probably require one or two more talks, but that's going to be the foundation. Then I'm going to discuss some traditional problems of representation that worry us when we try to give our account. The motivation for actually discussing those problems even before we start talking about the taxonomy that we present in the second part is that we're actually giving an informational semantic account of representation. And obviously, as Mark reminded us before, these approaches tend to face certain problems. And we want to basically show that those problems can actually be met or avoided, even though we're adopting an informational, teleological approach to representation. The second part is going to be very packed, so I'll try to do what I can very quickly, and I'll probably skip quite a few slides. Okay. So the main thesis that we're advancing is that every representation, and we're going to focus on three specific instances, neural, mental, and symbolic, are all instances of functional information, or more specifically of biological information, but we're arguing that not the converse doesn't hold. So every instance of information is not necessarily representation. We're going to show that there are different types of representation that are hierarchically ordered. So this pyramid probably doesn't give the right sense, but basically we're thinking, and I probably shouldn't leave the microphone. So the functional information is the basis, and all these instances are informational in a sense. Neural representation is an instance of the functional information. Mental representation is an instance of neural representation, and the same thing for symbolic representation. But one thing that we want to do is basically try to make some order in the literature when all these different types are used interchangeably sometimes, and I think we gain much explanatory value by setting those apart. And then we can show that there are many organisms that can have neural representation, or at least we can use neural representation in an explanatorily useful way. Then less organisms have mental representation, and very few actually have symbolic representations, even though most of the literature actually talks about symbolic representation, even when they're not called such. Okay, so functional information. Very briefly. We'll be happy to elaborate more in the discussion if we need to. So firstly, I should say that this definition of function is very similar to Gualtiero's. The minor differences that do exist don't really have any significance for this discussion. But for those of you that might have forgotten, I'll just repeat it again. We take it as the causal role of an act, event, structure, or process that contributes to the systematically goal-directed behavior of an encompassing system. And I think Eva already suggested in one of her questions, I forget at which talk it was, but the level at which the causal role is described may be different for different systems and contexts, and this may determine the goal-directed behavior that we attribute to the relevant system. And functional information. We take functional information as any difference in the either external or internal environment of a system that has made a non-incidental or systematic difference to the system's goal-directed behavior. In that sense, we extend the well-known definition of Bateson's definition of a bit of information as any difference that makes a difference. But we obviously emphasize here the fact that we want to look at the goal-directed behavior of the system. Here I think it's already important to note at this stage that we obviously advance an informational-based notion of representation, and I think we heard today Gualtiero telling us that when we're talking about natural representation in the sense that Gualtiero defends, it takes it to be some sort of probabilistic information in the Dretske sense, in the Scarantino, and your sense, of course. And then when we want to move from that to natural representation, then we add the notion of function, the function of carrying information, etc. But on our approach, as soon as we start talking about something as being functional information, it's already there. So teleology plays a role already at that level. And we said it for a biological structure or process to have a non-incidental functional effect, it must have been produced through ontogenetic and or natural selection. So here we want to emphasize the fact that it's not just phylogenetic evolution, but also ontogenetic processes. So the learning through development, through cultural exposure to culture, etc., we also consider a selection process. Learned functional information is the result of exploration processes followed by stabilization processes in a receiver. So again, this goes back to what Ulrich told us, but fortunately he had to leave already, and I think Rosa mentioned that in her talk as well. The concept of exploration stabilization can be rather complex to explain, but I'll just mention one example. So when we're talking about trial and error learning, we have a case where when an organism is faced with a novel situation to which it doesn't have a ready-made strategy, it basically explores a vast space of possible solutions to this problem, and it actually starts trying them in either random or pseudo-random manner. And every time a good strategy is found, the set becomes smaller and smaller until it stabilizes on a very small subset of all these solutions. And on our functional view, information is not merely a matter of correlation between types where the states of one system changes the probability that another system is in a specific state. So I think this already shows the difference from, I guess, the view that you're trying to advance, Gualtiero and others. And on our account, it has to make a functional difference to the receiver already to count as information. Okay, now, we've heard already that naturalistic theories of representation aim to answer the question of why does R represent state S1 rather than a different one, S2, and I think Mark drew my attention to it in a different conference that we had a couple of months ago, and the main question that we're going to deal with is why does R represent something in the environment? And over and above it, just carrying information about it, right? So in our view, every representation is a case of information, but we want to see what we gain by talking about something being a representation rather than just it carrying information about something for the receiver. But there are often many problems that we find in the literature discussed again and again every time that we see either a teleological explanation of representation or an information-based account. There are a few more. I was hoping to touch on the first three, but I will probably just go through the first two so that we have time to actually give you the positive account. Okay, so firstly, the Swapman problem. The Swapman is a molecular duplicate of Davidson, or an individual, rising by a massively improbable chance after a lightning strike in the swamp. According to this thought experiment, it lacks any evolutionary or learning history. and thus accordingly, none of its representations have any content, right? On the standard teleosemantic views, at least. And this thought experiment teaches us, supposedly, that such a molecule-for-molecule duplicate would behave in just the same way as an evolved system, right? A system that actually evolved through interaction with the environment, with other agents, etc., etc. But so the proponent of this problem argues it would have no states with representational content. So we see two possible replies, two lines of approaching this problem. On the one hand, we've got the dualist view, and the swapman's mind is unable to represent or recognize the world, since it lacks the mental properties or substance, depending on which dualist view you endorse, and acquired for the representational content. So the emphasis, at least that Davidson gives us when he talks about it rather briefly, the swapman cannot recognize because it never cognized. So it didn't have the original experience, connection with the environment, the causal connection, and so it never cognized. So we already emphasized that to emphasize the importance of memory, according to our view. Now the other approach, the monist view, which I think most cognitive scientists would endorse, but maybe others do not. Anyway, the swapman does have representational content, and when it's a molecule-for-molecule duplicate of the original cognizer, the swapman must also have the proper content bestowing biological history, and by that we mean all the historical products already assimilated in it. And so on our view, what we're basically saying is that the causal connections with the environment have been engineered in some way. If you don't like the word engineer, just use, I don't know, whatever else you want. And that actually, those connections, those assimilated products enable its recognition. Even though there was no cognition as such, if we want to look at the history, it does recognize those things. That's just the way that we understand the thought experiment. I mean, that's the way that, that it was suggested. So for example, if we take particular synaptic connections, in the swapman, they're in such and such way because their reinforcement, pruning, and stabilization occurred by particular environmental inputs in the original cognizer. And those have been replicated by chance, obviously, in some way. And whatever products of learning and development have resulted in the original cognizer in Davidson, they also, by stipulation of the thought experiment, exist in the swapman, thereby giving rise to representation of X's, whatever they are, in the environment upon encountering them after having been produced. Moving on to the disjunction problem, this one is closely related to the problem of misrepresentation, and we've heard quite a lot about it today, so I won't elaborate too much on that. But the point is that if a system goes into a state Sx, in all of its normal encounters with X, say a case of a fox in a particular context or a particular situation in the world, then this state Sx is supposed to represent Xhood or foxhood. But if the system entered that state Sx when faced with a different token, a token of, say, a dog that's clearly different than a fox, under subnormal conditions, whatever they are, the state Sx would represent not just foxhood in our case, but rather the disjunction of X and another Y. So in our case, foxhood and doghood, and obviously there's no reason to stop just at two disjuncts. Now, descriptions of the disjunction problem in the literature typically specified in terms of explaining in a non-circular way how that state Sx can correctly represent some things that cause its activation, the X, the fox, whatever it was, yet misrepresent other things that cause it activation nevertheless, in our case, the dog. Now, on Dretski's theory, for example, he says that the conditional probability of Sx given X is 1. So I think it's very clear that this problem would arise unless there are some other further constraints introduced. Fodor, on the other hand, argues that a symbol And here, I draw your attention to the fact that we already moved to the symbolic representation realm. He argues that a symbol expresses a property if it's nomologically necessary, that all instances of the property cause tokenings of the symbol. Now, the general strategy for solving this problem is that the tokenings of state Sx fall into one of two classes. The first one, there's a strict nomic covariation that holds between the x and the Sx. And Sx is never token when encountering an object, property, relation, whatever it is, of another event, y, that is different than x. And in the second class, that's where we deal with misrepresentation, a tokening of state Sx upon encountering y, a different token, is a misrepresentation, since the content of Sx is fixed by instances of the first class, where the nomic covariation obtains. Now, there are two variations on this strategy. The first one, I think, is the one that Fodor endorses. He tells us that what happens in the case of misrepresentation is that we've got subnormal conditions. So whether it's poor lighting conditions, or it's the wrong angle to look at this object from, the distance is different, etc. And Dredski endorses the second strategy. He talks about critical learning period, which is the time where the individual, upon encountering all these tokens of x, where the nomic correlation, the nomic covariation obtains, he actually forms the concept of whatever it is, and that basically results in Sx being token only upon encountering those x's. But then, as soon as that learning period is over, if the organism encounters a different object or event that is different and still tokens Sx, then we enter this second class.
Yeah, you got 5 minutes.
Thank you. Both the problem and its proposed solution are framed in terms of misrepresentation, and this typically applies, according to our view at least, only in the narrow case of symbolic representation. So we argue that only symbolic representations can be qualified strictly as either true or false. When we're talking about non-symbolic mental representations, and you might recall that pyramid, so if we're looking at that rows saying just mental representations, they don't need to be symbolic, and in that case they cannot strictly be true or false, but rather compatible or adequate or incompatible with the represented entity. Now, we can talk more about veridicality of information and representation later on in the Q&A, but for now I'll just skip that. So-called tokens of the state Sx assume that representational content can be isolated to a neural circuit. I mean, we've all talked about the cognitive state, that state, or whatever, and that, I think, assumes something about that state being isolated to a particular brain region, an attractor state, whatever it is, or a neural circuit. But we think, and I think that goes back to what Mark said before about the classical way of looking at the three ingredients of the representation. So he called them the cognitive state, the environmental stimulus, and the user, which then raises the problem of naturalizing that user. And we basically say that the representation is basically formed on the basis of a few things, not so far from the classical picture, I guess. We've got the attractor state, but not only the attractor state, also the general state of the nervous system, right? If it's in a state of a particular arousal or whatever. There's the animal receptors, say the retinal receptors, if we're talking about visual information coming from the environment, and regularities in the world. And by that, we also include all the particular physical conditions that obtain. And accordingly, the representational content of X is actually a function of a particular relation of all these elements, not just one of them. So if we look at a rabbit, for instance, as an organism or an animal that represents a fox of particular importance, obviously, when it is in a particular attractor state, SX, and a general nervous system state, whatever that may be, hungry, under specific retinal conditions, in a particular Fox-related context, then it enters state SX, the relevant state. But when, say, the same rabbit all of a sudden mistakenly represents a raspberry bush, and bear with me, just I don't know, it has the right shape, the right size, and this, I don't know, this rabbit suffers from cataract or whatever, that can be mistakenly represented as a fox, but that actually implies that there's a difference, at least in one of these elements. So the rabbit can still enter this state, SX, even when viewing that raspberry bush, but that means that something else has gone wrong. So something is wrong with the receptor, something is wrong with the physical conditions, and so on and so on. So just looking at a particular state as if it can be isolated, I think is misleading. Okay, 20 minutes already?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll just skip that problem as I expected. And then I'm just reminding you again that what matters to us, I mean, the problem that we're trying to solve is basically what makes R a representation of X, and whatever notion of representation we have, biological representation, neural representation, etc., over and above it being or carrying information about X. Hand over to Eva.
Yeah, well, I will try to continue as well as Nir did. When we're talking about, when we're going to talk about neural representation, I just want to say that this is for us an instance of non-mental representation. There are types of information organization in the world that we can call representation, and we now want to qualify it because not all functional information can be called or need be called representation. But we are focusing here on neural representation, but we can generalize it to the kind of representations that, for example, exist in a chromosomal region. We can do that, but we want to focus on the neural case. So what we're saying is that a neural representation, what we want to say is that a neural representation is an instance of learned functional information. We're talking about learning here. This is the example that we're taking, in which the neural relations first, there is a correspondence between internal and external relations. This is a general kind of idea that has been proposed already in the 19th century by Herbert Spencer. This was his notion of representation, but it is obviously not sufficient, because there can be many correlations between internal relations and external relations. Another thing that we are demanding is that this correspondence involves active exclusion of certain stimuli and local reinforcement of the stabilized state. And we also require that it persists long enough to support online updating and also, and importantly for us, because we're talking about learning, offline recall of the external conditions. So we require memory, so that there is something that is retained even though it is not used. It is latent. And if there is this latency, if there is this active exclusion, and if there is this correspondence, and I would add one more thing, if there is some constraint that is coming from the system as a whole, or from some some part of the system that encompasses the particular system we're talking about, this is also this constraint is very, very important. We have to have some top-down regulation on the system. And obviously there is a bottom-up regulation as well. So here is a little model, and this is a model, very, very simple model of Pavlovian learning. Now, in Pavlovian learning, let's say that you hear the ring of a bell, and then you are presented with food, and then you salivate, because this is the response to the food in a hungry animal. And now, and then you are just presented with a bell, with the auditory stimulus, and you respond with salivation. Now, so what we're having here is a state of the world. The state of the world is such that there is a bell, and then, after some temporal lag, there is food. And this is received by the nervous system, by the brain. As a result of that, so we are first having in T1 the first stimulus, the bell. As a result of that, there is some neural circuit that is responding to this. This but it is responding to this only if at T2, at the second time, there is the second, the dog is exposed to the food. This is also related to the same unit to which the first circuit is attached, and this convergence leads to a strengthening of a synaptic connection. This is the first thing that so here we have some external relations reflected in some internal connections which are temporally, where the temporal structure is very, very important. The other thing that is happening here, and this is where the exclusion bit comes, there are two types of exclusion here. When typically in an animal, when it is doing one thing, it has one reflexive reaction, it is inhibiting other reactions. So that is why CPG1, which is the central pattern generator that is leading to salivation, is inhibiting actively others. The other thing that happens is that any time that an animal acts in the world, it has to compensate for the sensory effects of its own action vis-à-vis the world. This is called reafference. So there is another type of exclusion that is happening in this system, and this is the EC arrow that we're seeing here. So we have here exclusion. We have also memory here, which is embedded in the gray blob, where we see that there is, which is showing us the convergence site where the synaptic connections are being strengthened. In this particular case, it's a very, very simple story that I'm telling you here. I want to say is that we can think about this circuit, this whole circuit, as a kind of neural representation. It is not a mental representation. It can happen in a neural preparation in a Petri dish, right? Kandel has done these things. And so we don't have to think about it as a mental representation, but it does, according to our definition, and you can argue with our definition, of course, it's not written in stone, but according to our definition, it is a neural representation because it satisfied all these things. I want to add to this just this point that, of course, in the animal, there are very strong constraints which do not exist in the Petri dish on the actual behavior of the system, which are very, very important for the animal. Nevertheless, they are not neural constraints necessarily at all. They can be more constraints due to the bioelectric fields of that morphology imposes. Okay, so this is neural representation. It doesn't have to be mental in any sense that we recognize as mental. But so what is mental representation? This is the Holy Grail, right? This is what we're trying to understand. So we want to say that mental representation is a very special type of neural representation that requires, in addition to all the things that we're talking about, that the mapping from the environment, or from the environment is anything that is outside the system. So the environment is also the non-neural body, right, for the nervous system. So there is a multi-feature pattern mapping of sensory and action relations, which is based on a hierarchical system of representations mapping each other and on updated bidirectionality of this top-down, bottom-up relations going on the time. The reasons for suggesting that for complex kind of compounds, where there are multiple features, either in the environment or if you have to model your body or model your future activity, the reason that we need multiple levels is that it is simply in order, if we were not to have multiple levels, we will need an almost infinite, huge infinite system. Hierarchy is a very economical way of dealing with world. And I must say that me and Nir are not, we are arguing a little bit about it. I'm very much buying into the Bayesian framework here. Then there is a storage of patterns. Now, storage of patterns is not the same as synaptic connections in the simple sense. Of course, it is based on synaptic connections, but it is not a coincidence that vertebrates have the hippocampus, which is a particular dedicated structure, memory organ, so to speak, in the brain for patterns, for storing patterns. That insects have the mushroom bodies, that crustaceans have hemiellipsoid bodies, that octopuses have the ventral lobe in their brain. So they're dedicated structures for storage of patterns, for memory of patterns. It's not enough to talk about local synaptic connections. So we need this kind of things. Then we also need that the learning process of these compound things, compound percepts and compound actions, is affected by the overall functional value that the percept, that the percept is acquired. So water for a thirsty animal has a very, very different value than water for a hydrated animal, for example. And many, many other things, and we can imagine many, many complex things as well. Now, what it means, if we're thinking about all these complex things and all this complex assignment of value to different percepts, to different types of actions and so on, this kind of representation requires that the animal can learn in a very open-ended manner, so that because it can learn all kinds of combinations in the world and it can assign value to all the possible combinations that it can perceive, it means that it can learn a hell of a lot. It is not like the first picture that I showed you, which showed a very local and basically reflex-bound learning. This is not reflex-bound learning. This is the type of learning that many animals, but not all animals, can do. But it demands quite a lot in terms of functional architecture and in terms of the structure of the nervous system. And of course, in order for this to happen, the animal has to be able to discriminate between patterns and also store and retrieve patterns of percepts and of action. So again, we need the storage of patterns and action, and we have to have a system that can assign value to anything, almost anything. Of course, there are constraints. So here is a very small and toy model, and which is showing world learning, the learning of something in the external world. And it is absolutely minimal. It doesn't have millions of things. But what we are trying to show here is the R1, the squares R1, R2, M1, and M1. The R's and the M's are just the receptors and the muscles, right? These are the sensors and the effectors. All the round things are the neural units. And what we're seeing is here that, that the animal is getting a lot of information from several receptors. Here we showed only 3. That go to from the receptor, it goes to some neural circuits. From the neural circuits, it goes to another higher level where these are integrated. When they are the integrated units, in turn, must send signals and alter the signals coming from the lower level units. The higher level units, the SIU, the unit that integrates the information, sends and receives information from the memory storage unit. And again, we have here things that are happening at time t1. We are receiving a particular input from the environment, a complex kind of perceptual complex kind of perceptual input. And then we have a kind of reinforcement at time t2, but we get this reinforcement only if it is surprising, only if it is something that is not expected by the system already, that the system have not learned, because we're talking here about a learning system. Only if the system has not learned, is it learning something new. And this is expressed by the prediction error unit which is calculating, or and through neural inhibitions, by getting input from the reinforcement unit and calculating the surprise value of the input, and only if there is surprise is the actual unit that is responsible for the actual response, motor response, which is not a simple unit at all. It is also an integrating unit. It gets information from the whole body, from prospective action. So proprioception and interoception are combined here. And only then will it respond. A lot of things have been, it is a very, very simple model. And the reason that we are presenting this model is that it presents here the three major categories that we have to think about. The integrating units. And we're talking here about perceptual integration, about proprioceptive integration, and interoceptive integration that must happen for all this to exist. We need a memory unit which stores patterns and can update the kind of information that we're receiving from the world and from the body. And we need a unit that is calculating prediction errors on the basis of the particular inputs that it is receiving in the here and now. Okay, so we need all these three things. Now, I'm not showing this picture to you in order to frighten you or to talk about it very much. All I'm trying to say is that this kind of ideas are used a lot by people today, and they are, and this is one of the many papers that Fresco and colleagues have written throughout the years. And this is an attempt to describe this kind of structure in a particular brain region for visual information in the mammalian brain. Now, I want to say just very few things about the behavioral kind of, about the behavior of an animal that, about the open-ended behavior of an animal. What we're talking about is what we require from the animal. If we're just talking now in behavioral terms, we require that the animal is able to bind different features and use the bound whole for learning. And it can bind perceptual things, and also it can bind temporally. Its own, it can learn a whole sequence of actions. And we also require that there is cumulative learning, so that the compound conditional stimulus can become an unconditional stimulus for another compound conditional stimulus. So if I learn that something is beneficial for me, something compound is beneficial for me, then I can learn that if I'm presented with the first kind of compound percept and then afterwards with another kind of compound percept, the second compound percept is also beneficial. So it's transitive. Right? Now, many animals can do it. Not all animals can do it. It's very interesting that the animals that can do it actually have the brain structures that are homologous to the kind of brain structure that we recognize that can do this kind of things in the vertebrates. Okay. Now, we call this very open-ended kind of ability to learn unlimited associative learning. Because de facto, you can learn almost, of course it's limited, but it is unlimited in the sense that you can learn a hell of a lot of things. And the reason that and the properties of the system the functional properties of the system that I described, this binding of whole percept of actions, of taking into account the state of the body and the state of prospective action and all these kind of things, and the value which has to take into account the whole state of the body, all these are hallmarks of what people are talking about when they're talking about an animal being aware, an animal having a mental state, being minimally conscious. It doesn't have to think about thinking, right? We're just talking about it actually seeing rather than just processing visual information. So that is why, and I can go into the whole list, if you want, in the Q&A, whole list of properties that people have assigned to consciousness in the philosophy of mind literature and in the neuroscience literature, when the neuroscience of consciousness. And we can see that there is a very good compatibility between the properties of the open-ended associative learning and the functional system that have to subserve it, and this list. And that is why we're saying this kind of system, a system that is able to learn in this kind of way and that is implementing this kind of functional structure, is something that we call a mental system. You can argue with it, and you are very welcome to argue with it, because it is a very bold kind of suggestion. Nevertheless, it is something that we put on the table exactly for it to be discussed. Now, the other thing that is very intuitive to us, and that is the reason that so many people, when they're thinking about representation, they're thinking about that. Right? They're thinking about symbolic representation. They're thinking about language, or about pictures, or about maps, topographical maps, and things like that. In order for us to have what we call symbolic representation, it's a mental representation, but it has a public face to it to some extent, if you want, and it has to be the symbolic representation has to be part of a semantic network mapping representations to symbols which are accepted as symbols by a community of representers and communicators. Now, of course, the paradigmatic case of symbolic representation in human is human spoken language, where linguistic symbols form a network and are conventional and hence publicly shareable. And what is very, very interesting with the symbolic representations, of course, there is a new level of relations that is overlaying the system of mental representations, which is private. It can be very private. It doesn't have to be, but it is a private system. What I feel, I feel. But it also is very interesting because once we have this shareable public system, then we can begin to talk about the truth value in a very broad sense. Every sentence in the language can be either true or false. And the number of true or false things is infinite, therefore. It is not the case with deception. There is deception in the animal world, a little bit, very, very little bit. Very interesting why it is such a little bit. And I think, but once we have a symbolic system, the lie becomes a great thing. Okay, so here are the conclusions. We think that talking in terms of functional representations is a useful way of approaching the kind of problems that interest us as people who are interested in biology and in cognition. And we think that a way of talking about functional representation can resolve or avoid some classical problems. And this is, and Nir has talked about this. As we learned from Michael Lachman, it is actually quite useful also for physics. Because if we think about selection, not in terms of natural selection, but in terms of selective stabilization or differential stabilization, then a lot of things can be, then a lot of information, we can reframe it within a framework of functional information, as Michael suggested. We offered here 3 levels of representation, which are based, all of them, on functional information. Neural, which is a specific case of non-mental representation, mental representation, and symbolic. And we think that one of the good things about our approach is that we are committed to some extent, and we're trying to be compatible with the actual work in cognitive science that is going on. For example, it is compatible with Bayesian psychology and with the general idea of top-down, bottom-up theories of cognition, and it even can be compatible with more specific versions of it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so we have a lot of time for questions, so let's start from you.
But hang on, first of all, you need a microphone. And while you're waiting for the microphone, I'll just make a disclaimer. Eva said before that we're still arguing about the Bayesian inference. I think that's okay. The top-down, bottom-up is also okay. Whether we want to commit to Freestone prediction error, that's a different story.
Yeah, we have a, yeah. I'm not sure. I'm thinking about Freestone a lot.
Well, thank you. I have a few questions, but I'll ask one. It seems that your notion of representation is externalist because it is information-based. So I was surprised to see your response to Davidson and about the swapman problem. And I always like to defend Davidson, so it's an opportunity. Because if you have an externalist notion, so for instance, if you have like in the cases of twin Earths, okay, so there is a difference between a water representation and an XYZ representation, even though the neural substrate in the brain is the same. So now, but if you accept this, so then when it comes to swapman, so if swapman, you know, is created from something, how would you know if what is being represented is H2O or XYZ? Because both of them are, you know, in the brain of swapman is completely identical to both the H2O guy and to the XYZ guy. So it seems to me, but more generally, I'm not sure why simply not to accept Davidson's externalist solution. It's not dualist, it's monist, but I think it's very compatible with what you say.
First of all, we do accept the externalism about content. And I think to an extent, knowing whether the swapmen actually represent XYZ or H2O might be an empirical question. I mean, I think what we will want to say is that if the original cognizer actually recognized it or cognized it as H2O, then the swapman will recognize it in the same way. All we're saying is that when you look about the swapman and you say that because the history is not there, because the swapman that was generated by some miraculous lighting storm now created an organism that didn't actually encounter all these things, that didn't have causal relations with that environment, that's a good enough reason to say that it doesn't represent. It doesn't represent because it didn't present, or the things were not presented to it in the first place. But I think that's just, I don't know, maybe playing around with terminology a little bit. I think once we accept that the history was somehow assimilated into the swapman, then by stipulation, all the relevant connections that exist in the case of, say, Davidson also exist in the case of swapman. Now, if Davidson recognized something as XYZ instead of H2O, I don't know. Unfortunately, we can't ask Putnam those questions anymore. But whatever Davidson represented, we would say the swapman represents as well.
Well, if you want to give, I'll give you an example. Let's say there are two people. They are exactly the same, and not exactly the same. They represent the same thing. One in English and one in Polish, right? Water has a different. It's a different water in voda in Polish. Okay, this is it. So, and they represent exactly this, and this represents exactly the same thing. But it does. But in a sense, it does. And in a sense, it doesn't, because they know different languages, and the knowledge of different languages is also represented in the brain. So you cannot just say XYZ is, what does it mean, this difference between XYZ and H2O or water? If it has some kind of meaning, if it's a different language, even if it is represented in the same kind of, in the same kind of local circuit, local attractor, it will not be exactly the same. If it is the same, it is the same. Then we don't have anything to talk about. But if it is not the same, if there is any meaning to this XYZ versus H2O, then there is some kind of difference in the brains of H2O talking people and XYZ talking people.
So I will just say that I think that you are not externalists.
Okay, good. So
I don't know. I'm a biologist.
There's a question. So who has the microphone? Yeah.
Thank you. I enjoyed that, and I want to.
After.
I want to have a follow-up question, but I don't want to talk about XYZ and H2O. So in the old days, there were Polaroid cameras. So suppose I take a picture of Nir, and out comes the Polaroid film. And then I take a blank, and I put it in my photo lab, and I spill chemicals on it, and I get it to be, but I didn't get any light from you. I just spill chemicals on it, and I get it to be molecule for molecule duplicate of the photograph of you. Is my swamp photograph a photograph of you?
You know, it's, the level at which you are describing the system, I think, is misleading, because you are talking about who is it that has the representation, right? Who is it that has the representation? If you show these two pictures to two people and you say, is it Eva? They'll say, yeah, same picture.
But is it a picture of you?
If they recognize it as a picture of me, it is a picture of me. Of course it is a picture of me. But it is only a picture of me by some cognizer who can recognize it as a picture of me.
But it isn't being a picture factive? It can't be a picture of you unless you were causally related to its origin? No,
it is a picture of me that where a miracle happened in your lab and created a picture of a woman. And then you showed this woman and said, wow, this is Eva, look at that. And then you say, haha, it's not Eva, it's a fly.
Well, forgeries can do that too. But perfect forgeries can do that too, but that doesn't mean that the forged Mona Lisa is the Mona Lisa. So a forged picture of you is not necessarily a picture of you.
But here you're introducing cultural content.
Causal relations to the external world, which is what an externalist should.
Exactly. You are changing the system. You are changing the system, not at the local level of the perfect copy of the Mona Lisa. You are changing the world in terms of the history of this world, in terms of the norms of this world, and in this kind of terms. And this is why we were saying that when you are talking about representation, you have to take into account not only the local attractor, but the whole vast system in which it is embedded, including, in this case, in the human case, including the history, including the norms of society about what counts as real and forged, and so on. So.
Okay, so here there's another question.
Just an aside for information, around 1994, Roger Young, a philosopher in Aberdeen, I think, produced an argument against Swamp Man, roughly saying that over time, the lack of history will matter less and less while you engage with this individual. And you can think of cases where there's incremental backup of some complex online system, the system crashes, the incremental thing is restored. Anyway, that's not what I really want to talk about. I'm interested in the general kind of system you're building, and I wonder how you think it will deal with the situation where I'm listening to your lecture, which is a unique, complex, very complex, structured object, which is made up of parts, which of course are familiar words, phrases, and so on. Does the theory say anything about what's supposed to happen in me during the course of the listening to, and perhaps not entirely, but mostly understanding what you're saying, without which I wouldn't have been able to ask this question?
So you're asking if we know how to build a system that somehow does this by magic?
Sorry?
No.
No, I'm not talking about
how we build a system like him.
What's
going on in his head?
Yes. What does the theory explain? Something that isn't just recognizing something that's been seen before, but is taking in an entirely new structure. These words have never been produced before, and the longer the phrases or sentences are, the less likely they are to be repetitions of anything said before. But we can understand them. And in linguistic theory, there's a lot of that's been said about this. In computational linguistics, there's a lot being said about this. But I'm not sure how it fits into the kind of theory you're presenting. Maybe it does.
Yeah, well, what we're trying to do, I mean, we're a very long way from understanding how the brain works, and especially how the human brain works. I mean, we are not very well advanced even in the case of Aplysia californica. Yeah, I mean, we know more about it than we know about the human brain, but obviously there is a lot we don't know. So the easy answer to your question is, of course not. Of course we don't know what's going on in your brain, certainly not in detail. What we are trying to do, and this is the ambition, and maybe the, I don't know, megalomanic ambition of this talk, is to say something that will give some kind of clue, at least to differentiate between what is going on, not in your head, but in the head of a dog when it's seeing a bone, or when it's seeing water and it is thirsty, and what is going on in a plant when it is responding to a lack of water by sending roots and things like that. Now, these are two different things. One has a mental representation. One doesn't have a mental representation. The plant doesn't have mental representation. It has some type of very complex structure about which we can probably, for computation, especially for computational reasons, talk in terms of representations. Especially, it could be useful. We don't know very much about that either. In very, very little we know. But what we're trying to say is that there are certain systems that we have to think about, certain relations that we have to think about, certain types of things that have to be in place for this type of process to happen. We may be absolutely wrong about that, but we are offering this as a proposal.
Okay, so there's a question there and two questions there. So.
Yeah, thank you. So I also have like two questions, but one is related to the Swanman thing. I'm sorry, and the other one just clarificatory. So I wanted to hear more about your solution to the disjunction problem. So concerning the Swanman thing, I wasn't sure. So the way you responded to Ron and the way you presented the things, so it seemed that your solution. So people usually bite the bullet, but your solution was to say that because the original Davidson actually. The mental states of Davidson had certain functions, then the Swanman also has certain functional information because it's supposed to be, a copy, something like that. Now, I think that maybe, the usual way of framing the Swanman problem might be misleading, and I think that may be a reason why that seems a solution. So, so the idea, I think, is that, so my heart has a function because my heart is a copy of, there's a causal mechanism ensuring that my heart is, supposed to be like the heart of my ancestors. But the idea of the Swanman case is that the Swanman is not supposed to be like Davidson. It's not a copy of Davidson. And in that sense, different from the case of the picture, because, the picture, I look at the picture of Nir, I put the chemicals in the black thing, and this picture is supposed to resemble the other. I think what's striking in the case of the Swanman is that Swanman is not supposed to be a copy. It just happens to be a copy. So you cannot say that, it has a function in virtue of, being, a copy of the other, because it's not a copy. It just happens to be like that.
Why does it matter?
If it's not a copy, then I don't know why the Swanman problem is such a problem. It's either a replica, as I think Davidson says, or it's not. If it is, then
it doesn't have to be a copy by replication. It happened to be a miracle happened. You said a miracle.
Mm-hmm.
So if a miracle happened, and here we have this Davidson, molecule for molecule the same, including the synaptic connection, the DNA, the state of the gene expression in every cell, the epigenetic things, everything, the state of the hippocampus, everything is the same. Never mind, why do I care how it happened? Why should I care?
I think that he has a follow-up on this issue, right?
Hang on, wasn't there a clarification?
I don't know whether there's time.
Yeah, you want to say something more? Maybe you can keep it for the break, because there's...
I think
You done?
No,
okay, you can.
I just wanted to make sure that I understand the solution to the disjunction problem.
Okay.
So, so you mentioned the idea of an attractor, and you mentioned the idea that there's, the system is very complex, and you have also many other states, and you mentioned the idea that there is always, when the representation is false, something goes wrong in the system. I wasn't sure what's doing the work in your solution.
So here we didn't get a chance to elaborate on it too much. I think we only had 2 slides on symbolic representation. What we did want to say that once you actually start talking about the veridicality of the representation, that only applies when we talk about symbolic representation. So we're talking about statements, propositions, etc. They have truth and false, falsity values, but not, say, non-symbolic mental representations. About the disjunction, what we wanted to emphasize is not so much about the veridicality of the representation, but rather saying that instead of just focusing on this state SX, which is as if it's like a particular neural circuit or a particular brain region, and you can just isolate it and look at it at an fMRI and say, okay, this brain lights up this way in this instance. It lights up in the same way also when the perceiver, who happens to be the owner of this brain, sees, I don't know, whatever it was, fox, dog, or whatever, and then we say, aha, now we need to explain the case of misrepresentation. What we're saying is that it's misleading to actually look at it from such an isolated point of view, and we're saying we need to look at, say, an attractor state, and we might enter the attractor state in both cases when seeing a fox and seeing a dog, but you also have to look at the general state of the nervous system. Say in this case, we still have to look at, say, the retina or the retinal receptors if we're talking about visual stimuli, and of course we still need to look at the relations that obtain outside. I just don't think it's very probable that we can just look at the brain and say, this is what's happening. We need to look at a complex of things.
Okay, last two questions there. I think you had a question, right? No, yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you said that for neural representation it can happen in a neural prep in a dish. I was a little surprised by that because it doesn't seem like that satisfies the functional constraint, that what it's doing was, you know, produced through ontogenetic or natural selection processes and continues to be stabilized for the purposes of the system.
Yes, of course. I mean, this is just to say that if you isolate the system, it can satisfy the kind of conditions that we have mentioned. But of course, this system, this kind of system wouldn't exist had it not been for evolution. I mean, we isolate a system which already has in it inbuilt synaptic memory, for example, which is dependent on temporal differences and things like that. This has evolved. This is not, and so on. So all we want to say is that if you are taking this definition, or in this case, maybe it was misleading to give the example of a preparation. I just want, because we were talking about neural representation, I gave this because this kind of things have been done. But of course it is the product of evolutionary history, and it could be also, depending on the preparation taken, the product of ontogenetic history of the particular aplysia. A better example that we could have given for a system of representation representation in a very kind of computational sense only would be a cell, a single cell, with the chromatin structure, not just the DNA, the chromatin structure being a generative model which generates, and then we can, and I don't want to go into it, but one can describe this very well in terms of this representation, and it is an intentional system. Intentional system in the sense that it contributes to the survival and reproduction of the single cell.
You had if it is a very quick question. Okay, so let's thank the speakers and let's
take coffee break for 15 minutes.